Hi there, everyone. This is Sarah from Myosh. Welcome to our webinar today. Today's topic is very popular. It's the COVID-19 vaccine. What are the legal issues for employers? So before I introduce our presenter, I just want to say, please put any of your questions into the Q&A panel and we'll attempt to answer them at the end of the session. If you want to chat to me directly, use the chat panel. The session is being recorded and an email and with a podcast and a video will be sent out later today. So today's webinar is going to be presented by Brian Jackson. He's a special counsel for Moray and Agnew lawyers. He's a prominent lawyer in human resources, industrial relations and employment law, advising, representing and appearing as counsel for clients across the education, mining, construction, energy, financial services, health and not-for-profit sectors. Brian's advisory role has involved leading and managing risk, compliance and governance, special projects, change management and restructure processes, strategic, industrial and employee relations, and industrial and workplace disputation. With his deep legal and industry knowledge and long history of experience, he truly understands how workplaces are run. He frequently presents trainings, webinars and papers on a lawyer's view on workplace well-being and taking the legal perspective to create strategies and review systems and processes to promote healthy teams and minimize risks. So with that, I'd like to welcome you today, Brian. Thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. So the topic, as Sarah mentioned today, is legal issues for employers around the COVID-19 vaccine, and in particular the issues around whether employers can direct employees to take the COVID-19 vaccine. The first point that I just wanted to make before diving into the PowerPoint in the presentation is obviously this is almost a day-by-day proposition, a movable feast, as people say. So it's really important to keep an eye on recent updates. The Fair Work Ombudsman updated its website on the COVID-19 vaccine last Friday. So, it's a question of always watching this space. So can I have the first slide, please? So this slide has got two contrasting images, and it's just an important way perhaps of leading into the topic and some of the legal issues. So the first slide on the left is the rollout, the first people vaccinated in WA, in Western Australia, on the 22nd of February. So the rollout has begun. And I think that has been accompanied, as you can see by the image, smiling faces, people looking to get the vaccine. On the right-hand side of the slide, I just like Novak Djokovic, so I put that slide in. But I put that slide in also because obviously there were boos at the Australian Open about the vaccine. I don't know whether that was specifically about the vaccine or where we're headed to, but there's certainly a fair bit of concern and a fair bit of discussion in the community about the vaccine. I've seen some statistics that we're going to see a significant number of people either refuse or have serious concerns about the vaccine, and there's certainly in the community a lot of debate and a lot of consternation about the vaccine. Can I have the next slide, please? So again, this is just a leading slide, but in November, the Qantas CEO, Alan Joyce, made comments indicating that at some stage international travellers might need the vaccine to get on a flight, no jab, no fly. And that was very original at the time because not many airlines were saying that. And again, just to get some of the buzz of this issue, certainly in this state in Western Australia, the West Australian put out an article 2 days ago in the West Australian, and certainly the view in that article was that WA employers said that they would strongly encourage their staff to get the vaccine rather than forcing staff to get the jab. And an interesting comment made by one of the employers in that article, the Professional Aesthetic Industry Register, said this: for me to put any requirement on my staff like that, i.e. to take the jab and risk losing a staff member, I'm just not going to do it. And Qantas and Virgin indicated in the same article they were holding off on releasing their COVID-19 vaccine policies until there was more certainty around the resumption of international travel and border restrictions. Qantas had previously suggested it would likely require passengers heading abroad to be vaccinated. However, it is waiting to formalise its stance until international flights are ready to take off again. So this is certainly an evolving issue, and a lot of, certainly this article is indicating that a lot of employers are taking the view that they won't necessarily make it mandatory, but will strongly encourage it. Have the next slide, please. So again, just as many of you would know, the Australian COVID vaccine national rollout strategy has indicated, as you can see from this slide, voluntary and free. And there are first priority populations: aged care and disability, residents and workers, frontline healthcare workers, quarantine and border workers, around 30 to 50 ongoing hospital hubs in urban and rural Australia. And I'll circulate this presentation, but I've put the links there so people can just have a sort of a quick and easy access to it. And as I've said earlier, on the 19th of February, on Friday, the Fair Work Ombudsman issued its most recent update on the vaccine rollout. And that's an excellent document and probably a good starting place for people who are researching the issue. Can I have the next slide, please? So also on the 19th, on Friday, to come at the same time as the Fair Work Ombudsman issued its document, the statement was made by Christian Porter, the IR Minister, that in the current circumstances, the overwhelming majority of employers should assume they have no power to force employees to vaccinate against COVID-19. But then he went on to say that, as the Prime Minister has said many times, the government expects that the overwhelming majority of Australians will want to be vaccinated to protect themselves and their loved ones, and so they can get on with their lives without disruption. To follow on from that, there's been a lot of statements from the government around these issues. But one weapon in the government's arsenal is that it can make what are called public health orders, and they've made a number of them around the country, state governments, around a whole range of issues to do with COVID-19. But at this stage, no public health orders have been made requiring the vaccination. And certainly if there was to be a public health order to be made, employers and workers would need to comply with those. So I think it's a question of watch this space, because there's been a lot of discussion around that issue. But we're yet to see that yet. Can I have the next slide, please? So turning to, I suppose, the existing law, because there is a fair bit of existing law in this area. And obviously the fundamental underlining principle that already applies under occupational health and safety legislation and under the common law is that employers have a duty to ensure, as far as practicable, that their employees and people who attend their premises are not exposed to hazards. That is already an existing obligation, and certainly that's clearly a legal principle. The issue will be how that will be applied as the vaccine rollout gathers pace. So the question that I've put there is, can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated? And it depends on a number of circumstances. So first of all, whether if I take you through these dot points, whether a specific law requires an employee to be vaccinated, there's none at the moment. Whether an enterprise agreement, employment contract, or employment policy includes a provision about requiring vaccination. At this stage, my experience has been that that's likely to be limited, although certainly, and one of the recommendations I'll make at the end of this presentation is to look at putting in place some sort of employment policy around vaccinations. And then thirdly, and this is probably the real question that's being debated and discussed at the moment, is whether it would be lawful and reasonable for an employer to direct its employees to be vaccinated. And that's really the key question. And the issue of reasonableness fundamentally is a factual question. Lawful and reasonableness is a factual question. So can I have the next slide, please? And I'll take you through this notion of reasonable and lawful direction. So under the general common law, employees are required to comply with the reasonable and lawful directions of their employer. Now, that principle applies across a wide range of potential directions, but in this health and safety context, an employer already under the general law can issue directions to ensure the health and safety of employees and customers, including requiring employees to undertake medical examinations to assess fitness of work, and directing unwell employees to stay away from work to prevent the spread of illness, not in a COVID context, but just in a general context. So if you've got employees who have stress issues or whatever it is, the employer can direct them to attend a medical examination. So that's been found to be clearly a reasonable and lawful direction. Now, the notion of reasonable and lawful direction also has been applied in a COVID context. So employers can direct employees to take a test, work from home, take personal leave or self-isolate. Now, the Fair Work Ombudsman's document that they put out, and they've been adding to it as it's gone, includes the following statement, that is that the circumstances where a direction is more likely to be reasonable are, for example, where the employees interact with people with an elevated level of risk, so people in hotel quarantine, border control, security guards at hotels, people working at airports, and second of all, employees who have close contact with vulnerable people, so employees working in health, aged care, etc. So those two criteria, the elevated risk of infection and the vulnerableness of people interacting with, those are factors that are more likely, it would seem, to make that direction to have the vaccine reasonable. On its own, just the mere fact of the pandemic does not automatically make it reasonable to direct its employees to be vaccinated. Now, there's been a lot of debate about whether there is a general right, or whether in general terms it's a lawful and reasonable direction to direct any employee to take the vaccine. At this stage, that is not resolved and will depend on the circumstances of the workplace, and it's going to depend on the reasons for the refusal, and I'll come to that in a little bit more detail. And I've also made the observation as that I think as vaccinations increase and borders open, and that increases the infection risk, it may be more reasonable to direct employers to take the vaccine. And obviously the issue of community expectations will change, I suspect, as we go along, in that people who will walk into a salon or hairdressing or gym will have an expectation that, given that there's a personal interaction, that the person that they're interacting with will be vaccinated. And there's a lot of issues to be dealt with in that context, including how people certified, etc., etc. So that is, as I said, there certainly is a level of uncertainty about that notion of reasonable lawful direction. So perhaps just to move that forward, the commentators have spoken about a number of different reasons for refusal. So the first reason is this: if people have health reasons, allergy, pregnancy. The second is religious grounds. And the third is what I've broadly called philosophical grounds of objection: civil libertarian, people who don't believe in vaccination, anti-vaxxers. That's a loaded term, but I've broken it up into those three criteria. And I've listened to a number of religious leaders speak about this. And the overwhelming view certainly is that from a religious perspective, most religions, and I'm certainly no expert, are agreeable to vaccination. So, so broadly, those are the different reasons. Can I have the next slide, please? So what this slide does, and it's an important slide, is what to do if an employee refuses to be vaccinated after a direction or a request. So what I've done there is I've set out in the first dot point that if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, the employer should do these sorts of things. Ask for the employee to explain their reasons for refusing the vaccination. In other words, come to grips with it. Look at are there any other options available instead of vaccination? And certainly we, over the last year, these sorts of issues and, around working from home, masks, PPE, have become, really de rigueur in this area. So having a look at that, discuss the employee's reasons for not wanting to be vaccinated. And if it is for a medical reason, the employer may wish to obtain a medical report as to why the medical condition is relevant, and rather than just the employee say so. And I'm going to come to a couple of the cases in a minute where that was particularly relevant. I made the observation, and a couple of commentators have made similar comments, that certainly it's likely that medical grounds for refusal are likely to be stronger than what I call the philosophical grounds, particularly where those medical grounds are supported by medical evidence. So, and I'll look at that in the cases in a minute. But I think at this stage, certainly given some of the comments that I made from the article in the West Australian, employers, I think, need to be really careful about considering any disciplinary action, certainly at this very early stage of the rollout, and need to be equally careful of suspending staff, certainly on an ongoing basis, because of the risk that such a suspension may be seen to be a termination of employment. So then further to that, if there is an ability to direct the employee, that even if there is a refusal to comply, termination may still be unfair. So that even if it's strictly speaking within the contract or within the general law, it may still be unfair because there may be other options available, failure to consult, etc. There's extensive law about the fairness of a dismissal, but employers need to be really careful about dismissing employees at this stage. So I'd like to look at a couple of decisions on the flu vaccine and that have come out very recently. So these aren't the two decisions I'm going to talk about now were not decisions on COVID-19 vaccines. Obviously, were too early for that, but they were about flu vaccines, about directions to take flu vaccines during the course of the pandemic. And they raised some really interesting issues and I think give us a pointer to where we may be going here. And the facts of the cases are really important as well. So the first case is Glover and Ozcare. There's been, again, a fair bit of discussion about these decisions. You may have seen some commentary already because they're really the only guide points at the moment. So in the Glover case, Mrs. Glover had been a long-standing employee of Ozcare, providing in-home care to clients. For the last decade, for the last 10 years, Mrs. Glover had been permitted to decline the flu vaccine because she said that she was allergic to the vaccine. She didn't provide any medical evidence as such that she was allergic. She simply asserted that based on her experience as a 7-year-old girl when vaccinated in the Philippines, she'd had an allergic reaction. Now, there was the tribunal said that the Fair Work Commission said there was no reason to disbelieve Mrs. Glover, and it was certainly her honest belief that she was allergic to the vaccine. And so for the last 10 years, Ozcare permitted Mrs. Glover to nominate her allergy and therefore declined to receive the vaccination. But the respondent, the employer, changed its policy during the COVID outbreak and required all its employees, whether working in aged care residential facilities or providing in-home care to be vaccinated. It was mandatory now. And in doing so and enforcing this requirement, unvaccinated employees couldn't be permitted to be rostered. And this resulted in Mrs. Glover not being permitted to perform any work. So she started taking her paid leave, her personal leave, her annual leave, long service leave. And once that was exhausted, the respondent said to her that they wouldn't have any rostered work for her. So she went therefore on unpaid leave for an indefinite period, and she was held in effect in limbo for some months on that basis. Now, at this stage, the decision that was handed down in only a few weeks ago, in 18th of January, was whether her employment had been terminated. That was the question. So it was a preliminary argument on whether employment was terminated. And the tribunal had found that she had been terminated because she couldn't just simply be held in limbo forever, and that the effect of the response decision not to roster her for any work in effect meant that her employment was terminated. But the tribunal did make some comments. If I can have the next slide, please, Sarah. It made some interesting comments about this notion of reasonableness that I've been talking about. And I'd like to just read that. I don't usually read large pieces of text, but I think it's quite illustrative of where we might be headed. So the tribunal said, in my view, each circumstance of the person's role is important to consider, and the workplace in which they work in determining whether an employer's decision to make a vaccination an inherent requirement of the role is a lawful and reasonable direction. Refusal as such may result in termination of employment, regardless of the employee's reasons, whether medical or based on religious grounds, or simply the employee being a conscientious objector. Then the tribunal said it's not inconceivable that come November 21, employers of men, and indeed women, men engaged to play the role of Santa Claus in shopping centres, having photos taken around children, may be required by their employer to be vaccinated, at least against influenza, and if a vaccination for COVID-19 is available, that too. The employer in these scenarios where they are not mandated to provide social distancing may decide at their election that vaccinations of their employees are now an inherent requirement of the job. It may be that a court or tribunal is tasked with determining whether the employer's direction is lawful and reasonable. However, in the court of public opinion, it may not be an unreasonable requirement. It may, in fact, be an expectation of a large proportion of the community. So just to pick up apart a couple of those, that paragraph. First of all, we're talking about November, the comments made about November. So that's a little bit away. And that the second notion is this notion of an inherent requirement. And that's quite a common notion. Is it an inherent requirement to have a vaccination? Now, that issue is a question ultimately of fact in terms of the role itself. And, it comes back to some of the comments that I made earlier about people working in quarantine or border restrictions. The risk of infection obviously is key there. And obviously this notion of community expectation is really key as well. And the question will be, what is that community expectation, and when is there a community expectation that it is reasonable that everyone is that the relevant employee is vaccinated? It's important to note that these were comments made obiter, which means that they aren't binding comments, and they just, I think, give us an indication that perhaps as situation evolves, it may certainly become more lawful and reasonable as we proceed. So that's a decision in Glover. Can I have the next slide, please? So the next slide is the second decision that I wanted to refer to was the decision in Arnold versus Good Start Early Learning, and that case was somewhat different. in that the employer determined that it would provide, again, the flu vaccine for all employees, and it would again make the vaccination mandatory. Now, what's different here is that the applicant, Ms. Arnold, refused to be vaccinated because of philosophical reasons. She said that there were breaches, that in justification of her non-consent to be vaccinated, she cited the forced labour conviction, the Nuremberg principles, and she wrote a letter saying, making the sort of bizarre comment as follows: I am Nicole Marie Arnold, in that I am Nicole Marie of the blood of the house of Arnold, relying upon the King James Version of the Holy Bible, Romans chapter 2, verse 11. I am a woman, I am a non-combatant, non-belligerent civilian. So that was somewhat unusual, but she refused, and the employer terminated the applicant's employment. Now, she applied, she brought an unfair dismissal application, but she brought the application out of time. So the decision that was, the decision that we have at this stage from 18th of November 2020 was an application for an extension of time. And it was found that there was no reason to grant that extension of time. So it didn't go beyond that preliminary issue of the extension of time. But one of the factors in respect of the extension of time is the merits of the application. Can I have the next slide, please? So the comment was made by the tribunal that prima facie, the respondent's policy is necessary to ensure that it meets its duty of care with respect to the children in its care, while balancing the needs of its employees who may have reasonable grounds to refuse to be vaccinated, involving the circumstance of their health and or medical conditions. It is also equally arguable the applicant has unreasonably refused to comply with a lawful and reasonable direction, which is necessary for her to comply with the inherent requirements of her position, which involves the provision of care to young children. But there was no finding made as to whether it was a reasonable direction or not. So an important part of this case, and I think where we need to distinguish it or note the difference between the previous cases, that the reason for refusal was this odd reference to these conventions, and it wasn't a medical reason. It wasn't health-based. And it is somewhat early to tell, but I think that it's likely that distinction is likely to be expanded. And again, I think that this case was providing care to young children and infants, and the question will be obviously whether that industry is a priority industry. But again, we haven't got much more than those cases at the moment, so this is a difficult issue, obviously. So can I have the next slide, please? And one of the other issues that's been, or other claims that have been raised, is the potential for claims for discrimination under Commonwealth and state discrimination laws and under the general protections provisions of the Fair Work Act. So those protections include that you can't take adverse action, including termination of employment or against prospective employees based on religion, pregnancy, physical or mental disability. Those are some of the grounds, obviously many more. But there is the exception for action taken because of the inherent requirements of the particular position concerned. So the argument I think that will be put is that in order to carry out the inherent requirements of many roles safely, and particularly those that require safe personal interaction, that can only be achieved by way of the vaccine. And certainly I think that is particularly relevant to border quarantine, aged care, those key industries that have been notified in the rollout as priority industries. So as I've said in the slide, that's particularly relevant to aged care, frontline healthcare workers, quarantine and border workers. But again, I think that these are issues that are still very much at the early stage of being analysed and reviewed, and I think employers should certainly take advice. Next slide, please. So this slide, and I deliberately left some room for questions, but what I've put there is food for thought, or questions or comments, or where to from here, if I can put it like that. This is, in my view, a movable feast. We're very much at the beginning of both the jurisprudence in this area and the rollout. I think we need to draw a really careful distinction between short-term, that is closed international borders, and longer term, the likelihood of open borders, international borders. We don't know when that's going to happen, and certainly it's going to happen. We can't live like this forever. And I think that issue of reasonableness and reasonable lawful directions is likely to, if not change, but be affected by the relevant circumstances. And again, that is also relevant to the industry and risk profile. The fourth dot point that I've made there is that, look, fundamentally, the fundamental principle is employees are required to comply with the reasonable lawful directions of their employer. Some commentators have said that includes taking the vaccine, that on its face permits that. My view at this stage is that that's probably unresolved. And the Fair Work Ombudsman, as I said, have said that in the current circumstances, the overwhelming majority of employers should assume that they won't be able to require their employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus. And I think employers need to be obviously very sensitive to that, and no employer necessarily wants to be the test case. So I've then made the point here that I think the Fair Work Commission is likely to view medical reasons for refusal differently from religious reasons. And I think the medical reasons, I think something that was highlighted in the Glover case that I've mentioned, is that in that case, the employee simply, it was her say-so that she had an allergic reaction when she was a child. It is likely that will evolve, certainly if we see, as the rollout continues, that employers should look to have potentially a medical certificate in due course. I've also noted, and I haven't spoken about workers' compensation claims, but that's something that just needs to be kept in the back of your mind, that there is the potential for stress claims for side effects, where an employee experiences side effects if the vaccine taken at the employer's direction. And then obviously there's the real possibility of future government intervention on vaccinations in the workplace. There are no government orders at the moment, public health orders, but I think it's a question of watch this space. I think that employers should just keep their eye on the rollout and on the Fair Work Ombudsman page. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the final slide, because I want to leave at least 10 minutes for questions. And that is what can the employer do? I have explored with a number of clients preparing a legally enforceable vaccination policy, and how that might evolve. I think the key here is providing information on the nature of the vaccination, the safety of it, the percentages that are coming out of other countries are extremely promising, in the 90 percentiles. So I think that issue of providing information is key. What are your arrangements for refusal? Arrangements for what do we do if with employees who do object, and then considering steps to develop and unroll that policy and adapt it as the circumstances change, as borders open up. So just in conclusion, and I'll take some questions, we are certainly, there's some uncertainty here. I think the key is, if you're going to look at making policies mandatory, for goodness sake, get some serious legal advice. And I think, the government's view has been that the vaccine is strongly encouraged. But I think we're going to watch this space. So I'm now going to take some questions. And can I just have the next slide, please? That's my details. That's oh no, next slide. It's just got my contact details.
Sorry, guys, I'm having a blonde moment.
So that's me, Brian Jackson, and my contact details, and obviously the slides will be with Myosh. And once again, just as usual, it's always a pleasure to partner with Myosh, and just to thank them for inviting me to speak today on what's a really interesting and important topic. So I'll take some questions now.
All right, Brian, we have quite a few. Some
Sure.
are more like statements or questions.
Comments are good.
Yeah, comments are good. So the first one is an anonymous comment, and it referencing that picture you had in one of your earlier slides, and he or she says they were booing the Vic Premier, not the vaccine.
Yeah, I know. I was just having a bit of fun with that. I was just having a bit of fun with that, but it was a pretty disappointing final in any event. But yeah, look, I know that.
Right.
But that was just a bit of fun. Next question.
Well, Jennifer says another reason for refusal is the patient's rights to refuse treatments.
Yeah.
Okay. Declan asks, and I think I asked this to you earlier, if you have the vaccination, can you still pass the disease on to others you come into contact with if you pick it up, even though you are vaccinated?
Yeah. All right. I'll deal with both of those. First is the right of refusal. I mean, fundamentally, the vaccination is an invasion of a person's person. And obviously people have the right to refuse that. We can't force people physically to do so. But if they, what we're talking about here, I suppose, is that that's a philosophical decision not to take the vaccine. And that's the question is, what's the reason for that refusal? Is that refusal because I don't believe in vaccinations, or I simply don't want it? I think the point being that I don't think that the point I was making about that was that having a genuine reason. Look, I've had allergic reactions in the past to vaccine. I've got Fragile X, or I'm not a doctor, but whatever the reason might be, that reason of there's a definitive medical reason as opposed to simply the right to refusal. I think that tribunals are more likely to look more favourably on reasons which are grounded in medical reason. Now, the second question, I think, from Declan, the ability to pass. I'm not a doctor, thank goodness. And again, I don't. Look, someone who has been vaccinated, I don't know whether they can pass it on. I believe the risk of that is relatively low, but I can't answer the medical basis for that. Only the legal stuff. Is next question, Sarah, or comment?
So from an anonymous, it's how about concerns of the actual safety of the vaccination as a reason to refuse? There is more than substantial evidence the vaccination is harmful.
Well, this is this issue of people who don't believe in vaccination, and I count friends of mine who don't who have concerns about vaccines, and we have significant proportions of the population who likewise have concerns about vaccines. I think the issue, I think when we get our first decisions and cases on this, is that people will simply say there'll be scientific evidence about all this, about the efficacy of vaccines. So I think the difficulty is that predominant scientific opinion is that the vaccines prevent the disease. But I would also say that I think that I've made the point a couple of times in this presentation that I think that as we get a greater proportion of the population vaccinated, I think the refusal becomes more harder, because community expectation will be that people are likely to be vaccinated, and that I think changes the notion of the reasonableness of it. So, look, I think that's a debate that's waiting to be had. Next question.
Okay, with the vaccination companies being protected or waived from damages and claims, will a business be liable for adverse reactions to workers if they mandate the vaccine?
Just repeat that, please.
With the vaccination companies being protected or waived from damages and claims, will a business be liable for adverse reactions to workers if they mandate the vaccine?
I think that those scenarios are going to, that's an issue ultimately of workers' compensation. I think that there will be workers' comp claims, and that will be dealt with under people's workers' compensation arrangements. And stress claims, and I think we will see those, and I did make that point in the presentation. And I think that certainly if it was me, I think we will see a significant number of claims, and then people going on workers' comp. I'm not a workers' comp lawyer, but there are various exceptions under policies around performance and stress and contribution to, and as I'm not a workers' comp lawyer, but I think that we're certainly likely to see claims, and I think it's something to certainly bear in mind as a risk factor.
Okay, so this next one's quite interesting. Declan asked, can the employer force employees to return to the office if everyone hasn't had the vaccine yet?
It's a very good question, and the Fair Work Ombudsman's note addresses it as well. I think the question there becomes this same issue around reasonableness. Is it reasonableness? Is it reasonable to direct? Is it reasonable to refuse to? It's really the opposite question: is can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because other workers aren't vaccinated? At this stage, I think that that question probably doesn't arise because we've got we only had a couple of hundred people. I think it's a question. I think employers need to really look, very, very carefully at that, and probably take some legal advice at the time. And what are the reasons for the refusal? I would have thought that at this stage, it's probably not. It's not going to be. Employees will need to attend the workplace, but I think it's probably too early to give a definitive answer to that question. I know there's some uncertainty, but what's the next question, Sarah?
Well, it's quite long, but I'll read it out and then I'll sort of say what I think he's asking. To what extent does the approval status of the vaccine have an effect, given that they've only have provisional approval, or in the US, emergency use authorization? From a straw poll on reasons for hesitancy, related common objections related to the short timeline of vaccine development, approval, plus the relatively new technology of DNA, RNA vaccines have not been having used previously. So I think he's referring to the fact that it's been approved and developed quite quickly. And is that an issue?
There's a fair bit of medical medical comment in that. Look, I think that this might not. I hope this answers the question, but look, I think that the average employer needs to rely on government scientific advice on this, and the scientific advice has been is consistently been that the vaccines are safe, and that employers should encourage very strongly their employees to take the vaccine. At this stage, I think directions, that we're probably a way away from that, and I think employers need to be quite cautious about that. But certainly, the overwhelming medical advice is that the vaccine is safe, and that it's efficacious. So I think that I hope that answers that question, or at least comments on that question. What's the next question, Sarah?
Well, they're all very hard. I wouldn't want to be answering this. Jim asks, is it reasonable to assume that those refusing the vaccine are the ones most at risk of contracting COVID and passing it to other unvaccinated people rather than those protected by the vaccine?
Look, I think that the key to this whole area is communication. And I think when people, certainly there's that assumption, but I don't think employers can necessarily make assumptions, and I think that's been one of the sort of the consistent messages from the last 12 months. If people don't want to take it, I think the question really becomes, well, why is that, and what are the ways in which we can address that? Can we address it another way initially? I don't necessarily think that there's any number of reasons why people might be refusing, and I think that the question of communication is really key there. What is the reason, and is it a cogent reason? I think it's a comment that certainly struck me recently was the comment that was made in the West Australian a couple of days ago by this employer, that to put any requirement on staff and risk losing the staff member at this current sort of time is a really tricky issue, and it's a sort of a hot button issue. But I think the key to that question that's just been asked is communication. I think it's a question of don't make those assumptions, and really talk it out with people as the vaccines grow. I mean, at this stage, we're only seeing the vaccines in the priority industries, although obviously that may change. Next question, Sarah.
Mark says, does offering an employee an alternative role within the company on comparable pay, etc., reduce the HR risk?
Yeah, look, I think all these alternatives are worth looking at, and particularly with sensitive employees, and options around at least accommodations around working from home, PPE, some sort of alternate role. But I mean, the issue there obviously is that people might still be interacting with other people within the workplace. But certainly, I think those are all options that are worth exploring. Next question.
Julie asked, should an employer segregate vaccinated and unvaccinated employees?
It's a good question. Look, it might be a solution at the initial stage. The difficulty is going to become that you can't necessarily do it forever, and clients will want it. It's obviously it's a client interaction issue as well. I mean, I think Australia. I think this is just a general comment that, and I've heard it a couple of times by commentators. Australia's in this very unique position that we don't really have to rush, and because of our low case count really around the entire country. So that, I think, sort of changes the dynamic a little bit. But look, I think that, and this really applies to a lot of industrial relations. I think it's a question of communication and looking at arrangements that people feel comfortable with as things progress. But yeah, look, that's a good idea. It's just a question of, is it going to be practical from running a business, whatever that business might be, in the longer term. Julie?
Okay, so John asks, if an employer recommends that employees have the vaccination where a risk exists in the workplace, could the employee sign a waiver to not have it? And what would be the implication if a subsequent infection occurred?
Well, that's it. I mean, what we have here is competing interests, because the employer fundamentally has an obligation to make sure that everyone's safe in the workplace. That's general. That's an underwrite. That's the existing law that employs a duty of care to its employees as far as possible. I think that issue becomes a much bigger issue the more people are vaccinated. I think that at this stage that's not a bigger risk. But the moment that you have 70-80% people vaccinated, that creates there'll be a community expectation that people are vaccinated. So I think that's likely to change. And so at this stage, the Fair Work Ombudsman's advice is that in the current circumstances, the majority of employers should assume that they won't be able to require their employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus at this stage. So I hope that answers that question. A couple more.
I think the next two are pretty much the same. So if an employer makes vaccines mandatory, would they be liable if an employee was to develop a reaction or have a side effect?
Just could you repeat that again, please?
If an employer makes vaccines mandatory, would they be liable if an employee was to develop a reaction or have serious side effects?
Well, I think that's the same. That question, a variant of that question came up earlier, and that is that there are workers' compensation issues there. That if an employee makes their own choice to be vaccinated, that doesn't pose any risks. Ultimately, it was their choice. But if it's a part of an employer's direction, therefore it was a workplace direction, that is likely, I would have thought, to trigger the workers' compensation policy if people have serious adverse effect if they get ill from the vaccine. It's all. I think that there is some risk in that. Obviously, that a person does get unwell and applies or brings a claim, but obviously that wouldn't be the case if they'd taken it voluntarily. So the more people are taking voluntarily in that sense, I suppose the better. Look, there clearly are risks, and we're clearly at the beginning of this. Go ahead, Sarah.
Brian, I have to say now that the questions are just, there's a massive amount of questions. So I think we'll put your your office's contact details on the email later today. And if they have more questions, they can try that method. I will say one of the comments that's coming up, Jonathan, and I think he's spot on. He said, thanks, you've interpreted it correctly, though it's a bit of a tricky one. And appreciates you going through it.
Look, it's my pleasure. This is not a look. This is a legal area, I think, where the principles are relatively clear, in the sense that we know that employers can give reasonable and lawful directions to their employees. The question really is how that's to be interpreted, and I think it's very fact by fact, depending on the reason. I think is key, as is the industry. And I also think that it's an evolving situation. And while the borders are closed, I think that is another key criteria that affects things. I mean, I think if it comes to, I think if I can leave here with a comment, it's that comment that was made in the Glover case that if the Santa Claus, that people were sitting on Santa's knees in 11 months' time, is that people may expect that Santa's vaccinated. I'm not talking about Santa coming from the North Pole. I'm talking about regular, real Santas, if I can say that. There'll be a community expectation that people are vaccinated, and so I think it's an evolving problem. I think people in the presentation I've actually added the link to the Fair Work Ombudsman site. There's a wealth of material on this. For me, I think at this point in time, I'd be very conservative. If I make a parting comment, very conservative about directions. I think it's. I'd be really. I would not want to do that without taking some real advice, and unless you're in a high risk industry. If I end on that, but more than happy to. If people wanted to ring me on my mobile, it's always on. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you, Brian. That was really good. I will, as I said, email that webinar and podcast out to everyone later. And I will put it, if they do want to continue having a discussion group, I'll put it on my LinkedIn, and they can comment on the topic there too. So thank you for joining us. And it was really, really good and very complicated. All right. Thanks, you,
Sarah.
everyone, for coming. Thanks, Brian. Bye.
Morning, good afternoon to everyone. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks.